Believe it or not, there are a lot of video games that have foraging plants as a major part of the game, whether it's tied into direct quests or crafting systems. Then there are others that have plants and herbs for medicine as kind of a side note or just a backdrop to complete the feel of the game. So in this video, we're going to go over some of the games that have foraging in them and talk about how realistic the plants and their uses are, as well as how important foraging is for the game. So let's get right into it. Red Dead Redemption is a game that takes place near the border of Mexico and the United States at around the time of 1911 or the very end of the Old West and gunslingers. You play as John Marston or his son depending on where you are in the game, and you are to fight your way through the Old West against gunslingers, wild animals, and bandits. The gathering of plants is very much intermingled throughout this game, with small side missions and some main missions that have you gathering plants throughout the land, or just helping a scheming elixir salesman. The plants in this game are very well done and pretty accurate in the way that they're represented. There are loads of plants to gather that are spread all throughout the map, from varieties of sage, white feverfew, and even prickly pear cacti. After gathering these herbs, you can sell them at a local store where they will be turned into medicine. Now, you never actually see that part, but it tells you in one of the game's menus what the herbs are to be used for. They did pretty well on this part too, because the uses are historically accurate for the plants they're talking about. There are a couple of plants that I'm not familiar with, like woolly blue curls. However, the white feverfew, butterfly weed, and prickly pear all grow in portions of the eastern United States. The sages are a common medicinal plant and kitchen herb that many are familiar with, so I won't talk about those. However, let's compare a couple of the in-game plants to their real-life counterparts to see just how well they did, shall we? First up is the white feverfew or Tanicetum parthenium, a small low-growing member of the chrysanthemum family with white flowers. It can be found all over a large majority of the United States and was originated in the Balkan and Caucasus regions of Eurasia. It has many uses, including for fevers and colds, and it even says this in the game under the description of the herb, which is really cool. Here on the left hand side you can see the in-game plant, and on the right hand side you can see the real life plant. So as you can see, they did really good for the looks of this plant. Alright, so now let's look at the prickly pear cactus or Opuntia. This is a cactus that many associate with the desert, but it can and does grow in parts of the east and southeast United States, and can even be found all the way up into British Columbia. This cactus is generally sought after for their fruits, which are supposed to be very tasty and juicy, which makes it certainly worth remembering in a pinch. Here on the left hand side is the in-game version of the cactus, and again on the right hand side is the real life version. So here you can see just how accurate they actually did, especially for a video game. Now, Red Dead Redemption still stands as one of my favorite games that has foraging as a part of it because of its accuracy in the plants and their descriptions. Plus the fact that each plant actually has its own range within the game world, with some having overlapping boundaries and others only in exclusive locales. This aspect makes its foraging and gathering of plants rather realistic and quite enjoyable, as the plants can be spotted from a distance due to their colors or shapes, or sometimes thanks to the survivalist map and the heads-up display, which will show the location of plants that are nearby. Next up is the open world survival game known as Far Cry 3. I haven't played the older one, so I'm not saying this is the only one in the series that has this, as I'm sure the others do too. As a matter of fact, there is another Far Cry game on this list a little later, so foraging seems to be an essential part of these games. Now, Far Cry 3 pits you, the player, in the jungle on an island controlled by maniacs who are essentially trying to kill you and chase you down. This game is very dark and has a lot of violence and gore, but with a plot like that, what do you really expect? Now, the whole time, you must fight for survival, gathering plants for making medicine and syringes that have all kinds of cool effects. Now, the foraging in this game is very fun and fast-paced. You can get skills that allow you to gather more plants and make more types of medicine. The plants are essentially broken down into colors of leaves, which is kind of unrealistic, but the names of the plants are legitimate, and the uses are kind of a split between true historical uses and over-dramatized versions for game effect. A really good example of this is the animal repellent syringe. Plants like arrowroot, heliconia, and the screw pine are all accurately depicted and named. The uses of these, however, aren't terribly realistic as mentioned above. However, most of these plants are tropical and subtropical species, so that fits in with the game. One of the plants in Far Cry 3 is known as arrowroot, which is a common plant that's found in starch form at health food stores. Traditionally, arrowroot was first domesticated in South America, and its Latin name is Maranta arundinacea. There are several other plants that are labeled as arrowroot and can be used in the same ways, but the people of South America used this starchy tuber first as a drawing pulpus, and it can still be used in this way today. Now here, if we look at a picture of Maranta arundinacea, we can see just how close they actually are if we compare the in-game version on the left to the real one on the right. Some plants like the golden beehive seem to be modeled after plants like Zingiber spectabile, a true ginger of the Asian maritime islands with medicinal uses for burns. Ironically, in Far Cry 3 though, you can use this plant to make your character fireproof. Obviously, that's exaggerated for video game effect, but hey, it's still fun. Then we also have the tiara flower, which is another good example of the accuracy of these game animations. This plant is also called Gardenia titensis, and the plant is a native of Polynesia and was spread throughout parts of the South Pacific thanks to the Polynesian navigators who frequented hundreds of islands within the area. Now, Far Cry 3 is a really great game to play and mess around with the foraging system because it's very fast-paced. The realism of the plants and their uses is pretty well done, plus being able to use them for something other than selling, like in Red Dead Redemption, is quite a nice perk to have. The plants pop up on the heads-up display when you are near them, and they are even color-coded on the map, so you can tell what color leaf you are getting ready to harvest. Obviously, there are some aspects that are unrealistic to its foraging system, but overall, it's really well thought out design that works well with this game. Now, the next game might be kind of a surprise to you, but Assassin's Creed 3 is worth a small mention. This is a game that puts you as Connor Kenway, a mix between native and white who is kind of an assassin. This game doesn't have foraging wild plants as a main part of the game. However, there is a main part of the story that introduces you to an herbalist that you allow to live at your homestead. The homestead is Connor's home, where the people he helps around the world come to live and apply their skills. Their skills can be used by the player to craft items that can be sold for money if the player so chooses. Having access to the herbalist allows you to craft various medicines from a few herbs like rosemary, snake root, sage, and madder. These were very important herbs in the Revolutionary and Colonial period, and their animation, although small, is quite good. Back at the homestead though, you can go to the herbalist home and watch him tend his garden of herbs. You can see his herbs drying in the dry house and even observe his small medicine tent with some bottles of elixirs and a cot to aid the sick in your homestead. And back at Connor's house in the kitchen, we can even see some herbs hanging by the fireplace, which kinda helps to complete the scenery. Now, the plants and herbs obviously aren't a big focus of this game, however, it was certainly worth just a small mention. Fallout New Vegas is a game that takes place in a post-apocalyptic wasteland modeled after the Mojave Desert and surrounding areas. Surprisingly, even in the nuclear wasteland, there are things to forage. Even though there aren't too many missions that have foraging as a focus, there are a couple that do. However, the foraging and plant gathering is very well tied into the crafting system, which allows you to craft different medicines and food from the items that you've gathered. All of this can be done at a campfire, which is really cool concept and well executed here. Some of the plants seem to be made up like Xandar root and Brock flower, however there are many realistic plants in this game like the barrel cactus, prickly pear, and honey mesquite pods. These plants can make items like healing poultices, cactus water, salads, and even more. Everything you craft from them has their own effects, and eating them as they are has their own effects too, with some pros and cons. The food and medicine heals over time, which adds a nice realistic touch to the system as a whole. The plants themselves are represented accurately, and their uses in the game are pretty accurate too. Like for example, the prickly pear fruits that you can use for cactus water, or using the mesquite pods for flavoring steaks. The desert salad, which contains a variety of foraged foods and some Brahmin meat, is another great way that the creators weaved foraging into the fabric of this game in a way that is fun, creative, realistic, but not too realistic. So let's take a little bit of a look at the barrel cactus, which is broken up into two main genuses, echinocactus and ferrocactus, which have multiple species in each one. These cacti are native to the southwest of the United States and have uses ranging from food all the way up to landscaping. Now this cactus is a pretty easy thing to draw, obviously, it's not too complicated, and they certainly got it right as you can see by the real one on the right and the in-game one on the left. I know that the prickly pear was covered in Red Dead Redemption and the animation here is a bit different but still very accurate nonetheless. However, this game has many more uses for the prickly pear and its juicy fruits, from making food items to even making cactus water to drink. Cry Primal is a game that places you in the end of the last ice age, fighting against the elements, animals, and other tribes. Everything that you do in this game is done from things you have gathered from the land, as should be expected for a game that takes place in the Ice Age. The plants and foraging, however, is kind of a mixed bag. While there are a lot of realistic plants that are used as background type plants, the foraging system isn't much different than in Far Cry 3, which is kind of a disappointment. Of course, there are new plants for sure, but what isn't new is the plants are still broken down into colors, unfortunately with no other names than red leaf, green leaf, blue leaf, etc., with all of the common names being completely disregarded for some reason. I will say that in this game the plants seem to be modeled after real plants, like for example, one of the red leaves is actually the Rafflesia arnoldi, or corpse flower as it's better known. This plant was ironically the inspiration for another video game character known as Vileplume in the game Pokemon. The corpse flower is from the area of Sumatra and has a stench of rotting flesh, as its name, well, implies. Another plant in the game is called Telopea speciosissima, or more simply, Warata. This is a plant from New South Wales and Australia that has had its size apparently exaggerated a bit just to make it fit in the Ice Age time that this game takes place. So as you can see, they did pretty good when they were modeling the plants after some real ones, even though they kind of disregarded the names, which they might have done because the plants are modeled after all kinds of plants from all around the world. The plants are found all over the map and seem to be somewhat randomly generated, as they don't appear to have any specific range except for a few like yellow leaf, which can only be found in the northern sections of the map, along with cedar. Red leaf, maple, and alder are limited to the more southern ranges, but the rest of the plants themselves seem to be scattered throughout, some even being in or under the water. This of course adds a really nice touch because there are multiple plants in real life that do grow around or even in the water. The uses of the plants can range from healing and providing multiple bonuses like scent or camouflage to protect you from predators, fireproofing, endurance boosts, making poison bombs, and even antidotes. Fallout 4 is another post-apocalyptic game where you must survive, similar in concept to Fallout New Vegas. This game takes place in and around the city of Boston and has a fair number of plants that you can collect. A few of the plants are real, like the wild carrot flower and cattail, but most seem to be fake, like the wild mute fruit or the hub flower. The plants that you collect are mainly used for food by just eating them as they are and then gaining health, but some are made into drugs or food recipes at cooking stations or chem stations. Doing this will give you certain bonuses to either damage resistance, reducing radiation, or even extending the amount in which the item heals your health bar. A few of the background plants like cattails are very well represented, though they have no use, which they totally should, as cattails can make all kinds of things in a nuclear wasteland. Either way, from harvesting plants to harvesting things like glowing mushrooms, you're going to be covering a lot of ground in this game and looking in certain areas for certain plants, which is kind of a nice touch of realism considering the other shortfalls of its foraging system. Now, I would love to compare the plants of this game to real life ones, but the only ones I can do that with are the cattail and the wild carrot flower. Another thing worth mentioning is that you use the flower of the wild carrot instead of the root itself, which I find a bit odd, as I've never actually heard of people eating the flowers. They might, I'm just not aware of it. The wild carrot flower is represented pretty well for the most part, except for the distinct purple flower in the center, with the leaves though looking nothing like true wild carrot leaves. I assume they did that because the fine detail of wild carrot leaves would be a pain in the butt to model in 3D, moving and blowing with the wind, so I can kind of forgive them there. Now, Fallout 4 is not much different than New Vegas when it comes to the foraging, except that New Vegas actually has a more comprehensive foraging system with a lot more recipes that utilize the plants you can collect, but Fallout 4 was certainly worth a mention anyway. Now, this certainly isn't all of the games that have foraging plants for food and medicine in them, but I think it's enough to point out how important foraging actually is. I think that's why we are seeing it in so many games now, is because the skill of being able to gather things from the land and use them is timeless. That in survival situations, or for other reasons entirely, plants have many things they can do for us. I see this as being acknowledged by the presence of foraging in video games, which is an interesting trend if we think about it from that perspective. The idea of something that seemed to fade from the public's minds within the past 100 or so years is kind of seeing a rejuvenation all over the place in modern video games. Okay, so there's a pretty good breakdown of some video games that have foraging and the plants that are within them. Some of them are pretty well done and others not so much, but the fact that we are seeing these things in games more and more is an interesting way to extend the game and add some depth. Plus, you might learn a thing or two if you do a little searching online. I know I certainly did when I was making this video. Either way, I thank you guys for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you learned just a little bit of something. If you want to learn more about edible or medicinal plants, make sure to subscribe.